Tonight marks the 15th Guthrie Medal that we have the privilege of awarding. This esteemed group share a passion and a track record of championing access to justice for the people of Ontario, especially the most vulnerable among us. The Law Foundation's vision is to put people at the heart of justice, and there is no doubt that Pam Cross embodies this vision. Pamela's heart and her drive for justice have improved the lives of thousands of women who've been abused. It's not an exaggeration to say that Pam's work has changed the way our legal system understands and addresses violence against women. Trailblazer, visionary, problem solver, critical connector, advocate, these words bear repetition because that's Pamela Cross. It's taken us decades to get there, but we now know that gender-based violence has many layers and intersections. And this is exactly the way Pam approaches her work. Part lawyer, part educator, part social justice advocate, Pam easily moves deeply within and across these realms. She shines a light on the experiences of women who faced violence, helping us to see and to understand their realities. Then she brings together the professions who are best positioned to make a difference. She's done this through holistic pro bono services, practical and accessible public legal education, client-centered training for lawyers, for judges, and frontline workers, and cogent research and law reform. At the start of her career, Pam ran a general practice in Kingston, I'm told. She worked primarily in family law for women who'd experienced violence. She reached out to community organizations and provided pro bono legal help. It was during this time that she recognized the void in family law consultation, education, and resources for women, and for frontline staff who serve them. That's when, as Carol Barkwell has shared with us in her nomination letter and tonight, Pamela set a path to meet this need. And what a path you've set. I have time for just a few examples. Likening it to Alice in Wonderland, Pamela's first research project with Luke's Place documented the experience of self-represented litigants in family court. She was among those who were early to seek to understand, help voice, and support the experience of self-represented litigants. Her research and report validated the need for pro bono legal services and paved the way for Luke's Place to launch its pro bono legal clinic. This clinic model has been replicated in Ajax, is in the process of adaptation by BC's Rise Women Legal Centre, and adjusted into virtual form, offering legal support through video conferencing to women in rural and remote communities in northeastern, northwestern, and soon to be southwestern Ontario. How amazing. True to Pam's holistic approach, the model introduced legal support workers who are staff at women's serving organizations. They support the women through the process and they learn about the law and how best to work with lawyers. In turn, pro bono lawyers are trained on the emotional and practical needs of women who've experienced violence, helping them to be better advocates. The model is innovative and smart, and it's also human. Education is an integral part of Pam's impact. To help legal practitioners better identify, understand, and work with abuse survivors, Pamela has introduced and led educational programs, as you've heard, for family court support workers, for MAG, Legal Aid Ontario lawyers and staff, judges with the National Institute, Judicial Institute, Law Society accredited continuing professional development, law school curriculum with the Law Commission of Ontario. And she has conducted research and developed tools on violence screening for family law practitioners for Justice Canada. In his letter of support for Pam's nomination, George Thompson, the former executive director of the National Judicial Institute, said this: "What made Pam's contribution so important was her ability to help the judges understand the real impact of the legal system's response to violence against women." Such important work. She's also a go-to expert for the violence against women sector. She's provided analysis and advice to dozens of organizations, as you've heard, at Luke's Place, but also for the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, the Springtide Resources, the YWCA, METRAC, and Ontario Women's Justice Network, Barbara Schleifer, Community Legal Education Ontario. The list goes on. There are few programs and trainings in the VAW sector that Pam hasn't had a hand in creating. Finally, I think it's fitting to end where I suspect it all begins for Pam, with the survivors of intimate partner violence. Last year, Luke's Place was proud to launch one of Pam's long-held dreams, a resource package for abuse survivors as they move through family court. It's a workbook, a court organizer, and website that outlines the process and includes insightful and practical tools about managing a legal bully, evidence gathering, and post-separation communication. Ultimately, the goal of the resource is to keep women and children safe. Strategic, pragmatic, and so compassionate, just like Pam. Pam, you have to come up here now. The moment has arrived. The moment has arrived. You hold it. Pam, on behalf of the Law Foundation of Ontario, it's my sincere pleasure to present you with the Guthrie Award. Thank you.
Thought I was going to lose it a few minutes ago and dissolve into a ball of tears, but I'll try not to do that till I'm done, because I have a few things I want to say while I have the microphone. First, I'm deeply, deeply honored to be receiving this award tonight. Thank you to the Law Foundation of Ontario, to my colleagues who provided letters supporting my nomination, and to all of you for coming tonight. But especially, I really want to thank Carol and Paula, my colleagues, my friends, who I've been conspiring with now for years about this issue of access to justice for women who've survived male violence, and the two who put this nomination together. Thank you so very much. And I'm going to do something, it's not in my notes, I never do it, but I just had a very interesting experience tonight. When I was in high school, I was one of 3 members of the Kitchener Collegiate Institute short-lived debating team. One of the 2 other members, Jonathan Rudin, is here tonight. I have not seen him since I was 16 years old. He is the executive director of Aboriginal Legal Services, and I think it's just pretty interesting that although our debating club didn't last for lack of membership more than anything, it was Jonathan, his younger brother, and me. You know, here we are, both doing social justice work as lawyers. Not that I think either of us would have anticipated that. So it's just really cool to see you here. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Donald Guthrie, who, as we heard earlier, died earlier this year at the age of 90. But I did do a little research about him. And Neil, where are you now, Neil? Thank you so much for coming tonight. I suspect that Donald and I would not have agreed on who to vote for in Monday's election. However, I read a lot of the comments that people made at the time of his death. And they described him as honorable, kind, honest, compassionate, considerate, and decent. And I think that's all a big message about what we're talking about when we talk about access to justice. I had wanted to be a lawyer since I was a kid, but I didn't get around to it till I was in my mid-30s because, you know, life happened. In between those early dreams of becoming a lawyer and when I did go to law school, I had 2 children, one of whom is here tonight. I was involved in starting a co-op daycare center at the University of Guelph because, God damn it, I was going to go back to university even though I had a baby. I briefly and entirely unsuccessfully, in terms of finances, owned a folk club and restaurant. I worked for Harrowsmith magazine. I became a political activist. I ran unsuccessfully in a provincial election, and then successfully for the school board in Frontenac County and met my partner of, I think, almost 35 years now, and created a blended family with him and his children, both of whom are here this evening as well. Over that period of time, I also acquired a criminal record. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to law school. My criminal record, in which I take a lot of pride, is the result of political activism involving nonviolent direct action, something we need more of today. In the course of that work, I found myself in courtrooms frequently, usually with others, usually representing ourselves. And I became refascinated with this institution, the law, to which our society gives so much power and respect. I wanted to learn more about it, to see how it could be used as a tool that would support social justice and change, rather than as a weapon of oppression. When I started law school, I wasn't thinking about women in particular. In fact, I think I had a picture of myself as a kind of modern-day feminist Perry Mason, righting criminal wrongs with or without Paul Drake and Della Street. However, it didn't take long at law school before I saw the many ways in which the law, despite such important advances as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, continued to deny women equality, and in particular, the failure of the law to respond to violence against women became undeniably obvious to me. In an act of supreme overconfidence, or perhaps insanity, after I finished articling, I opened my own practice, still not exactly sure what I was going to do. Of course, I had to open bank accounts for this new venture. That we learned a lot about in the law admissions course. I had to have a general account out of which I would pay my bills and at some point myself, and a trust account where I would deposit retainers from my clients. In doing so, I discovered that the interest generated on the funds in my trust account went to something called the Law Foundation of Ontario. I can't say I gave it much thought at the time, and I have to admit to you now, I don't think you made much money off my trust account. Very few of my clients ever provided me with a retainer. Soon after I had my business cards printed, my bank accounts opened, and my desk organized, a young woman, clutching a baby and accompanied by a friend, came into my office with a look of desperation on her face. She told me she'd run out of her house when her husband had pulled out a shotgun during an argument. She had had to leave her other child behind because her husband and his gun were between her and that young child. Now, I need to be clear here. This woman did not come into my office because she'd heard about this amazing new lawyer in town. Her friend had parked the car nearby, they saw my brand new shingle, and they headed through the door. I like to think I was able to assist her despite my inexperience. I do know that she helped me. No longer was I wondering what I would do as a lawyer. I was forever hooked on increasing access to justice for women dealing with misogynist violence. For several years, I did this primarily through my law practice. Mostly, I represented women involved with family court. But I also acted for women who had been criminally charged with one thing or another, most often shoplifting, most of whom had survived lifetimes of abuse and violence. I also worked for community organizations, shelters and sexual assault centers primarily, that supported women dealing with men's violence. This was in the heyday, which many of you will remember, of defense lawyers' pursuit of women's private records in sexual assault cases, and those sexual assault centers needed lawyers. Sometimes my clients had decent outcomes. Often they did not. Over the course of 4 or 5 years, I realized that both the family and criminal law systems as institutions, along with some of those working within those systems, were not able to respond appropriately to male violence against women. With few exceptions, laws have not been written to respond to the unique realities of male violence against women. And many of those interpreting and using those inadequate laws have had little or no education about male violence against women. As I continued to represent women dealing with male violence, I became highly traumatized by my work. Now, this is something we lawyers are not supposed to talk about. In fact, when I was practicing law, we didn't even know about it. Nothing at law school or articling or bar ads even mentioned the possibility of becoming emotionally damaged by the work of being a lawyer. I was completely unaware that the constellation of symptoms I had developed pointed directly to clear, classic vicarious trauma. Fortunately for me, I worked closely with the women's shelter in Kingston, where VT is well understood. The executive director told me that I needed to get myself to a therapist and to do it fast. I did. She was great. And I quickly realized that while I wanted to continue my work on violence against women in the law, it needed to be in a different way. Thus began what is now more than 2 decades of splitting myself between my personal life in Eastern Ontario and my work life, most of which is elsewhere. My work shifted from the individual advocacy of practicing law to the systemic advocacy I have been engaged with ever since. The Law Foundation soon became much better known to me than it was when I was a practicing lawyer. I quickly learned that part of what it does with that money it collects from lawyers' trust funds is to support access to justice work in communities across the province. And in particular, the Foundation's support has made the innovative work we do at Luke's Place possible. And for that, I want to express my sincere appreciation. My experience with the LFO, and I am not just saying this because they're giving me an award, I promise. My experiences with the LFO have been the most positive I've had with any funder. The generosity of spirit, the openness to supporting new and innovative and untested ideas, the willingness to work with fundees, all of this creates real partnerships and leads to outcomes that increase access to justice for those Ontarians who live largely in the shadow of the concept of justice that most of us in this room can take for granted. And that's what it comes down to for me, access to justice, something many of the women I've had the honor to work with and on behalf of for the past 3 decades deserve but do not yet have. 1 year ago today, Farah Khan, who I think had to leave because she has a baby at home, Farah Khan and I resigned as the co-chairs of Ontario's Violence Against Women Roundtable because of the complete lack of response from the new government to our requested and repeated questions about what they plan to do to address violence against women. So tonight seems an especially appropriate time to talk about access to justice. Yes, women have formal equality thanks to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and important court decisions. Yes, women in Canada are better off than women in many other parts of the world. Yes, things are better than they used to be, but that does not make them good enough. Women who have been subjected to male violence, whether that violence has happened within their intimate relationship, at work or school, in their religious institution, or in their community, face numerous and significant barriers when they look to the family and criminal legal systems for accountability and for protection. When women tell their stories of abuse, whether in criminal or family court, they're often not believed by the systems that they are told are there to protect them. Sometimes they're told to be silent about that abuse. And you know what's the saddest thing about that? Sometimes that's the right thing, because sometimes talking about the abuse makes the outcome worse. By conservative estimates, 25 to 30% of women are abused by an intimate partner, and yet family court remains focused on conciliation and friendly parenting, as if such concepts are even a possibility when one partner is bent on terrorizing the other. Women who engage in protective parenting are accused by their former partners of alienating the children. They settle again and again and again for custody arrangements that do not keep them safe or ensure the best interests of their children. Family court process itself, so-called friendly litigation, which I think is a bit like giant shrimp, pushes women into mediation, even when it's not safe or likely to lead to an appropriate outcome. Fewer and fewer women have a lawyer to represent them through their family court case. And with ongoing cuts to Legal Aid Ontario's budget, this situation will only get worse. Imagine being told that you would have to remove your own appendix if you didn't have enough money to pay for the doctor yourself. That lack of access to health care would be seen as an outrage. Yet a lack of access to justice in family law seems to be accepted by those in positions to make change. In criminal court, women who have been sexually assaulted continue to face out-of-date and long since disproven myths and stereotypes, actually they're lies, that makes testifying sometimes worse than the sexual assault itself. The system is so hostile for survivors that fewer than 10% of women even report sexual assault to the police. And that's despite the fact that approximately 1 in 3 of us will be sexually assaulted at least once. Criminal courts really know better in terms of access to justice for women whose partners have been abusive. It's no wonder that only about 1/4 of women subjected to intimate partner abuse report. But because of mandatory charging, a policy that made sense when it was implemented 30 years ago, but needs a serious rethink in 2019, men are charged even when their partners have valid reasons for not wanting that to happen. And as a result of mandatory charging, women who are the victim of abuse are sometimes charged themselves when they attempt to protect themselves or stop an anticipated assault by their partner. Every day, I enjoy the privileges, largely invisible to those of us who enjoy them, of being white-skinned, having grown up middle class, with parents who believed their daughters as well as their sons needed a post-secondary education and a career, being more or less of sound body and mind, and living in a wealthy and reasonably stable part of the world. Because I'm a woman, I also understand a little something of the marginalization that so many people in our communities experience every day of their lives. I try to bring both of those perspectives to the work I do, remaining aware of the access granted to me as a result of my privilege and the responsibility that comes with that privilege. A responsibility to challenge, to push back, to open doors, to invite others in. The work I do is intense. It's challenging, it's frustrating, it's interesting, it's humbling, infuriating, discouraging, moving, and inspiring. Sometimes it's actually funny. Every bit of it informs every other bit of it. I couldn't do any of what I do if I didn't do all the other pieces of what I do too. And I couldn't do any of it if I hadn't had those years in practice, where every day I was meeting with women who were dealing with family law, criminal law, and those court systems. Some days it does feel like too much, but then I remember the countless women in this country who are subjected to misogynist violence and have the courage to say no more, as well as the frontline workers who provide tireless support to them. And I'm re-inspired and remember what an honor it is to be able to do this work. In honoring me with this award, you are also honoring those women. Thank you very much.